The previous lesson, examined the historical development of the European Union and spent a lot of its time talking about essentially the growth of the European Union, how member states began to form part of the European Union, became and ascended to the European Union itself. And the process of ascension is something that's really important. At the time of recording, on the 12th of November 2023, recently the European Commission and the European Council released information about potential new members of the European Union, including states like Ukraine and Turkey, for example. So let's think about the process of accession to the European Union in more detail. How does one, as a member state, or as a state, should I say, wishing to become a member state of the European Union, go about this process? How does this actually happen? And like I said, we've briefly examined the history of the European Union, specifically points of enlargement and the process that this takes. And so we're going to talk about this in more detail, looking at how the European Union actually adds new members, the requirements, the criteria for adding new members to the European Union, as well as the current candidate states that could be new members of the European Union in the next few years. So EU accession refers essentially to the formal process by which a state will join the European Union and become a member state of the European Union. Very, very simple. Now, the process of accession itself involves essentially the joining of the original founding treaties of the European Union as amended by subsequent treaty agreements. And so this is what the process of joining actually entails. So in terms of the technicalities of joining the European Union, the process itself involves joining the founding treaties, signing on to and becoming parties to the founding treaties. The requirements of a state to become a member of the European Union, however, are outlined in something known as the Copenhagen criteria. So the negotiation process by which a member will become a member state, join the European Union, therefore, and as such, joining the original founding treaties, is known as the Copenhagen criteria. These were set out in 1993, prior to the more rapid enlargement of the Union with the accession of states like Malta and all of the Eastern European states like Latvia, Lithuania, and Romania. And they essentially involved the following requirements for a member state to become a member of the European Union. They must be a, quote, European country. Now, what this is actually entails, what it means to be a European country, is something that's quite interesting, given that the clear borders of what Europe is quite interesting to talk about. Turkey, of course, is a member of Europe, given the fact that you sort of have Istanbul being the edge of Europe itself. But then what about countries such as Georgia? Or countries such as Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan, and as we go further into places like the Middle East, how far do we go south, shall we say, before we can say, okay, we're no longer in Europe, we're now in the Middle East, or we're no longer in Europe, we're now in Africa? That's an interesting question, but in terms of the candidate countries that are currently on the list, they are unequivocally European countries. Okay, so countries like Turkey, countries like Ukraine, or countries like Georgia are all countries that are in the process of potentially joining the European Union, and they're all countries which are actually European countries. The further they enlarge, the more this question will become more and more interesting and more controversial, essentially. The second criteria is that they must be a democracy. Okay, so they have to exist in what is required to be a democracy, a democratic state. They cannot be a theocracy, they cannot be a dictatorship or a totalitarian state in any way. They must have free and fair elections. Okay. Next, they must have a functioning market economy. Now, you might think that this is just the imposition of capitalist ideology onto these ideas of European Union, but it makes sense that a functioning market economy is a requirement, given just how much of an economic constitution the European Union has. Joining the single market requires you to have a functioning market economy. You couldn't have a command economy in the single market because it wouldn't exactly integrate particularly well. There must also be the respect of the rule of law and fundamental human rights. Again, very simple and easy to understand. And then there has to be the final element, okay? This is sometimes known as the aqueous communitaire, And this is the idea that they must be willing to access and implement EU law. So there has to be the ability and the willingness on the part of the member states to actually apply EU law in their domestic context. That is arguably the most important element of this particular process, because every single candidate member state is going to have either achieved or be on the way to achieving the other four requirements. They're going to have been a European country, they're going to either be a democracy or on the way to the democratization of their state, they're going to be on their way to functioning market economy, and they're going to be on their way to respecting the rule of law and human rights. So then the question therefore is, are they willing and able to access and implement EU law, AQUIS itself, the law itself, AQUIS. The Copenhagen criteria essentially means that there is no dictatorship, no state-ran economic system, or any kind of states with with poor track records on human rights joining the European Union. Even if the Copenhagen criteria are met, however, it is not necessarily a guarantee of a position as a member state, because they still have to go through the accession process. Before the normal negotiation process will take place, the member state will have to meet the Copenhagen criteria. And then once this happens, and after usually a period of time doing a number of informal negotiations with members of the European Union, the European Council will have a unanimous vote to begin the formal negotiation process. Okay, this process of negotiations centers around the final of the Copenhagen criteria, the ability for the potential member state to adhere to the community law, to adhere to the Aquis Communitaire. The community law is divided into 35 separate policy chapters, each of which are going to be extensively negotiated to ensure that compliance is possible with the complicated and detailed process of EU law itself. And then once this happens, and once it is ensured that they are able to comply with and negotiate and apply the 35 separate policy chapters of the community law, the formal acquisition treaty will be drawn up. So let's think about some of the potential candidates. So two of the most prominent candidates currently include Turkey and Ukraine. Ukraine almost had the speeding up of processes following the invasion of the Russian Federation. There's been a lot of political back and forth relating to Ukraine's membership of the European Union, with states like Russia flaring their nose up at the idea of European membership. Countries like Turkey have also got controversies with them. So there is also the controversy of Turkey's human rights track record, whether or not they actually adhere to the Copenhagen criteria. But these are the two biggest, most prominent potential candidates. Turkey being a little bit, Ukraine being further along the process of membership joining than Turkey. Of course, there are various issues with both, as I've just mentioned. You have the controversial track record in Turkey, as well as respect for the rule of law, and you also have the current embroiling of Ukraine in an international armed conflict with the Russian Federation.